The Chancellor, His Excellency Dr. Mbuyelo Thabo Mbeki, the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of South Africa, Professor Puleng Linkabulo, they're both watching this inaugural lecture and send greetings and congratulations. To the professor that we are inaugurating this evening, Professor Sindile Amina Ngubane, her family members, friends, loved ones, members of the ESEDU College, management, staff, academic and administrative colleagues within the College of Education, UNISA students and visiting students from other higher education institutions, supporters, funders, and UNISA alumni, distinguished guests, boys and girls, and most importantly again, Professor Ngubane, Sindile Ngubane, the celebrity of the day, Molweni, Tobilang, Avuan, Dumilang, good evening, Huenand, Jambo. I acknowledge all protocol. My name is Tenjwe Meiwa, Vice Principal responsible for the College of Education. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, greetings and welcome to Professor Ngubane's inaugural lecture. She is Professor of Educational Technology and is the head of Institute for Open Distance Learning Research at the University of South Africa. I acknowledge and want to also welcome who will be actively involved in this program, Professor Makwe, who is the Executive Dean of the College of Education. We also welcome with such jubilation that we have Professor Sandra Sanche Gordon, who's a professor in the Department of Informatics and Computer Sciences at Escuela Politécnica Nacional de Velo in Ecuador. This is South America's west coast. She's serving as a respondent during this installation. We thank you, Prof. Sandra, for heeding our call. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you will agree with me that we live in turbulent times. And the turbulent times that we live in lead us to have resources that are quite far and few in between. And sadly, with those resources, we find that there is very little that gets to be accessed or being accessed by those that are on the margins. Professor Ngubane talks about this in her, not only this lecture through which we're installing her, but also through her scholarship. She is a full professor as we inaugurate her this evening, but the reason for her full professorial status is because of the work that she does, where she questions through her human rights work, through her questioning of people that have abilities that are different, and people who are on the margins. She's questioning and has been through her scholarship, pioneering and championing the sufferings, the injustices of these cohort of people, people whom she talks about in her lecture. Professor Ngubane is a good cadre, hence we are inaugurating her this afternoon and this evening throughout. And the reason for that is because we take these occasions of installing professors very seriously. We are very happy and are celebrating the fact that she is one of a few of female black South Africans who get to ascend this level of full professor. Now you will be asking me, what's a full professor? It's somebody who's done all that Prof. Ngubane has done, being a recipient of awards, being sitting on a whole lot number of across the globe. As we see, she's brought us Prof. Sanhe Gordon, who is the respondent. She's a mentor, a producer, and reproduces and often she takes her doctoral and master's students through all the work that she does. Her lecture talks about all these kind of things that you're going to be hearing this afternoon. She is indeed somebody that we're proud of, who is demonstrating what the university strategy seeks to achieve, what the African Union seeks to achieve, and just coming back home again, what the National Development Plan seeks to achieve, to ensure that we are adhering and opening access to everybody because the Constitution demands so. Hence the relevance of this lecture, that is breaking the access barriers through transdisciplinary research, one brick at a time, so she argues. The national disability prevalence in this country is 7.5%, but this is actually the disability that we know, and I'm not surprised that Prof. Ngubane concentrates on women as well in some of her work. It is women among the colleagues, nationals, and a whole number of people that live with disabilities that get to be affected. We see more women, more females than we see men in these categories. So Prof. Ngubane shall be sharing with us her ideas around this. I will not be coming onto the stage between her and her line manager, that is Professor Makwe, who's also his supervisor of a doctoral degree thesis. So in between them, she will be coming to the podium. I therefore invite Prof. Makwe to the podium at this time. Prof. Makwe, over to you, ma'am.
My role today is to introduce to you Professor Sindile Amina Ngubane, who was born and bred in Woolerfontein village in Pietermaritzburg. She holds a BSc Mass Communication from the International Islamic University in Uganda. She has a Bachelor of Education Honours in Educational Technology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Edgewood campus. She also holds an MA in Digital Media Development from the same university in Howard College. She has a PhD in Curriculum and Instructional Studies from the University of South Africa, and on top of that, she has a Technology in Distance Education and E-Learning certificate from the University of Maryland University College in the USA. Sindile is currently leading the Institute for Open Distance Learning, and in that position, she ensures that the people around the university conduct research that informs practice. One of the passions of Sindile is people and students with disability. And in this role, she has led the Advocacy and Resource Center for Students with Disabilities on several secondments. Sindile is also the president of the Distance Education Association of Southern Africa. In this role, she performs different roles, and also she's a deputy editor for the African Educational Review Journal, and she's also an advisory board member of the Cross-Cultural Human Rights Center Journal, a consortium of 1 European university, 10 Chinese, and 4 African universities. And the role of this consortium is aimed at bringing together Southern concepts and ideas in human rights to Northern audiences. Sindile, in her role as a supervisor, she has supervised master's and doctoral students, and many of whom had actually completed their doctoral degrees. She usually, when she supervises, she usually focuses on students who have disabilities and focus mainly on those that deals with inclusion and access studies. Sindile has led and co-led research and community engaged scholarship projects that aimed at enhancing access for marginalized communities. And her access issues have gone across those students with disabilities, especially those students who are also incarcerated or students who are in places where they are indeed marginalized. She has been invited to the African Union as a disability expert. She has been a visiting researcher at the Open University in the United Kingdom and the University of Cambridge. Her research and community engagement interests are in open distance e-learning. She has strong passion for disability, especially issues that deals with access, and she also does a lot of research on digital access for marginalized communities. She worked with different marginalized communities to find practical solutions for improving their livelihoods through education. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to our candidate today, who's going to be an inaugural professor, to come to the stage to talk to us about her work. Over to you, Professor Sindile Ngubane.
Madam Acting Vice-Chancellor, Prof. Meiwa, the Principal of Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization, the Acting Executive Dean, Professor Mpine Makwe, my respondent, Professor Sandra Sanchez-Gordon, from the Escuela Politécnica Nacional del Ecuador, colleagues from University of South Africa, colleagues from other universities, colleagues from non-governmental organizations, students, family, and friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, humble greetings to you, and thank you for logging in to listen to this lecture. The title of my presentation is Breaking the Access Barriers Through Transdisciplinary Research, One Brick at a Time. So, where did this journey start? When growing up, my mother, Umandaba, had a friend called Auntie Umamtolo Wazungu. Mamtolo had a daughter called Bawinile, who, like many other blind young people, had to travel far away from their home in Pietermaritzburg at a very young age, so she could access education at a special needs school. The only special needs school that she could be accommodated at was more than 300 kilometers away from our village. Through difficulties, she managed to make it to university, but still, she faced challenges with gaining equitable access to education. The second person that I would like us to also reflect on is Maringi. Maringi is a student with autism who had been complaining that she is not getting the mark that she deserves in her assignments. After a consultative meeting with the disability experts and the lecturer, the primary lecturer here at UNISA, we actually identified that she had autism, but also that she rather required alternative assessment. And after much deliberation, it was decided that Maringi should be given an oral exam. Maringi got distinctions when she was examined in a manner that considered her abilities. These two real-life stories of Sis Bawinile and Maringi demonstrate the importance of using research to enhance access for marginalized students. Research, both formal and informal, contributes to evidence-based improvement of teaching, learning, assessment, and student support strategies. This topic reflects the years of research, community engagement, and publishing on access for marginalized students to break the barriers to access through transdisciplinary research. So then one would ask, what does research actually do? What role does it play in enhancing access? So imagine you are asking yourself these questions. Through research, we gather evidence-based data which assists in improving our practices. Through research, we actually get to keep track of developments and check the impacts of interventions which guides our future planning. But most of all, research on access for students with disabilities gives the students a voice. It gives a voice to the voiceless. So then you'll ask, in my topic, I'm talking about breaking the access barriers. What is access then? There are various definitions and perceptions of access depending on the given situation. I'll briefly outline them below and then select the one that guides this lecture. According to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, access was primarily theorized as location. So it was about getting into buildings, it was about making sure that you design so that people can gain physical access. Then other authors like Gilmore, Fuchs, and Welby also emphasize this perspective by postulating that access is only present when students succeed in their academic outcomes. As time went by and policies changed in the 1990s, access was defined as participation in learning and assessment. With the introduction of No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, access was defined as outcomes. Though these perspectives emerged at different times, one common goal was to ensure that educational institutions provide access for students to learn successfully. Most universities approach access using the gender and race-based lens, and you will know, as South Africa, we're a country that has always been bothered about race. This limited view disregards the multifaceted discrimination which has led to the discrimination of students with disabilities. Matikizela Madia, who in her publication in 2021, acknowledges the complex nature of access, arguing that merely defining access as entering the university is not enough, but there is a need to see access as to qualify education in a spatially just context when already in the university. She also postulates that universities should understand that the political and ideological nature of the university space calls for constant revelation of exclusion and injustice that leads to a lack of access to quality on-site and digital resources for equitable education. To researchers like Gelba et al., who wrote in 2015, access is about buildings, curricula, and attitudes of academic and support staff towards students with disabilities. They further point out that most visible barriers are of physical, instructional nature, and where the academics associate reasonable accommodation with inferior curricular quality. So as we move on, I'll request that we look at access in a holistic way. It's buildings, it's access to digital platforms, as you know that we are mostly learning online. It's designing learning in a way that is accessible to students that are blind, that are autistic, that are deaf, that are actually, some of them do not have arms and hands. So how do you design in such a way that these particular students do not feel excluded? Now, like all other work, if you remember, my title was about breaking access barriers one brick at a time. Now you'll ask yourself, when you construct a brick, there are ingredients that you put. So I propose that when you are creating this brick that is going to break access, there should be international and national legal instruments and institutional policies. Then there is the issue of transdisciplinarity. There is critical paradigm. There is accountability. There is Ubuntu. There is empathy. And there is social and educational justice as actually the goal towards achieving this. So then, I present these particular different instruments. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have Convention Against Discrimination in Education, you have International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, you have Convention on the Rights of the Child. Then when you think about Bawinile walking and being transported for more than 300 kilometers, then you see the rights of the child. Then you have the Dakar framework for action, and that is education for all. So you can see that At last, all these are present, including the South African Constitution, Section 9. So you can see that when we are doing this work of access, we are not just doing it because we want to be academic activists. That is what Professor Reshma in UKZN, who was actually my supervisor together with Professor Khoza, who said that, Sindile, you are too much of an activist. So we are not activists, we are actually guided by instruments that tell us that we have to ensure that people with disabilities, children, all the people on earth actually have rights to education in an equitable way. Then we go to the second issue, and this one ties very seriously to my topic, and that is the issue of disciplinarity. Transdisciplinarity is a new means of knowledge production, a philosophical movement that is aimed at solving problems that require scientific, technological, and societal solutions. Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that the issue of access is actually represented in all these particular requirements. Then McGregory says, rightly points out that transdisciplinarity is appropriate in connecting science, politics, and technology with society in a way that respects the survival of humanity in a future that is worth living. Then the other issue that I pointed out as part of the ingredient is the critical paradigm. The critical paradigm also informs my contribution towards the empowerment of marginalized people on their own terms. All research that I undertake is aimed at shaping transformation. Accountability, which was another ingredient, makes people aware that there are consequences for their actions, meaning that higher education institutions, including basic education, should enforce accountability for those that deny equitable access. Ubuntu, which is another ingredient, is about subscribing to the principle of I am because you are. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. Meaning that humanity should guide the provision of education at all levels. Then the other ingredient was empathy. Without empathy, actually, you cannot provide student-centered learning and assessment. And then lastly, the issue of social and educational justice. When you are working with people at all levels, you have to make sure that you are just in the way that you provide the services and in the way that you respond. Please join me as I show you selected collaborative work that I've done to break the barriers, because you remember, I am a researcher. The first brick that I had to throw to that barrier was the brick that comes in through research. I've had projects like use of information and communication technology to facilitate access for students with disabilities. I've also had widening access for students and graduates with disabilities in ODL contexts, and this project was actually funded by the ODL Research Support Program. I've also had the technology-based student support in African open and distance learning, which was funded by the Tutuka grant. And with this grant, in the spirit of collaboration, this Tutuka-funded research project allowed me to invite Dr. Andrea Mangiatordi from the University of Milan, Italy. And we were able actually, through his support, to conduct hands-on workshop on accessibility in online content design. Designing for access capacity development, here we had actually different people within the university that work either as academics or support professionals that work with students with disabilities, and they had to meet with the experts from Italy again to actually deal with designing for access. And this was specifically a capacity development initiative. This particular one was funded by the National Research Foundation post-PhD grant. Then the other one, in this Women in Research funded project, Dr. Smandile True Love Mkwanazi, may her soul rest in peace, was the principal investigator and I, the co-investigator. This project has enabled for mentorship of emerging scholars with disabilities to take place and also allowed the viewing of disability management for employees with disabilities from diverse angles. For example, we have Professor Tombela, who's the Executive Dean at the University of Zululand, and here she's looking at the theorization of disability. Then we have Dr. Johannes, who's looking at it from a quality assurance lens. Then we have Mr. Matila and Dr. Mavuso, who are looking at it from the policy imperatives. Then we have Dr. Wells, who's looking from the psychological and employee wellness perspective. Then we have Dr. Moll, who's looking at it from a technological and auto-ethnographic perspective. Professor Madigizela Madia is looking at it from the special justice perspective, and Professor Nyoni is looking at it from the educational management perspective. This project is a true indication of the power of transdisciplinarity and how it actually ensures that we break barriers towards access. When I began this journey of problematizing access, I started with my doctoral work, which looked at information and communication technology as a learning tool. And I looked at the experiences of students with blindness. And this study was through narrative inquiry and life stories. I learned that though some universities have disability units that are meant to actually address issues of access, students are still facing systemic, epistemological, and attitudinal barriers. My study revealed that academics did not have adequate skills to design, teach, assess, and support and actually do research on and with students with disabilities. It's not that they are unwilling to do so, but because they have not been capacitated to actually design for inclusivity. Then, of course, this was my very, very first publication, which came from my thesis. And then we went on conducting research with an aim of dismantling access barriers cannot always be narrow. This work, which I did with Professor Tlale, looked at how children in conflict with the law are dealing with the need to access education as part of their rehabilitation. Education without digital literacy would not make them completely ready to function in the fourth industrial revolution. They would come out as half-baked. And this paper reveals the need to ensure that all educational entities, including those in correctional centers, should promote digital literacy to prevent offenders from involving themselves in crime again. This integrated model of skills should guide all educational institutions. As per the transdisciplinary nature of my work, I started engaging colleagues that were champions in their own disciplines and in their own niche areas on how they could problematize inclusion and disability in their own works. In this paper that I did with Professor Khoza from UKZN, we looked at the lecturers' experiences of teaching science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to students with disabilities. We know very well, think about your own university and your own space, how you deliberately exclude blind people or those that are, have physical impairments and say, no, they cannot enter a lab. So you can see why this study was critical. Working with my honors lecturer, who is Professor Khoza, who is renowned for his work on curriculum and also a STEM specialist, has taught at TVET colleges, enriched our contribution on disability in TVET colleges. This qualitative study, which was done through in-depth e-interviews and e-observations of classes, revealed that lecturers still use traditional teaching strategies, which in a way exclude students with disabilities. Yeah, so I was mentioning that it also revealed that students with disabilities get excluded from STEM subjects due to non-adoption of innovative technologies, which could be compatible with their assistive technologies. Also, lecturers do not have the requisite inclusive teaching and digital literacy skills which would enable them to teach STEM in innovative ways. The promotion of access to education requires one to be flexible and ready to adjust to any given task. While others strive to publish in isolation, being an access and inclusion scholar in a space where my niche area was under-researched, I actually worked with Prof. Letseka on the shift from open distance learning to open distance e-learning. This chapter explored the shift and how it could actually affect the marginalized students, hence possibly creating barriers towards social and educational justice. When you think about it, our students are not only from rural areas. Others could be from rural areas and also poor, meaning that they will not have access to digital affordances. But also there are people that are quite in the urban areas, but they are also disadvantaged. And then think of it, if that person on top of that, they also have a disability, it becomes some kind of a triple discrimination for that student. So the chapter then recommended that higher education institutions should consider the diverse needs of their students so that they can remain student-centered. Of note and relevance is this work of 2016, where I worked at accessibility strategies for making MOOCs for people with visual impairments. And this was a universal design for learning perspective, with an aim of demonstrating the importance of researching the interaction between the students and the learning platforms. This research provided clarification on multiple user requirements for improving learner interaction. And then again, Huang and Mohammed and Kribi point out that the importance of doing research that seeks to evaluate accessibility and inclusiveness of open educational resources and open educational practices to ensure equitable access for marginalized students, including those with disability. They suggest that the following accessibility principles should be used when evaluating access, perceivability, operability, understandability, and robustness. In 2017, I worked on the implication of UNISA's shift to open distance e-learning on teacher education. Now, you'll wonder, why teacher education? UNISA has the biggest teaching college of education with about 100,000 students. So what are the implications of this? Is that if you do not teach them how to teach inclusively, they are likely to go out to schools and maybe unintentionally exclude students with disabilities. And when we have a policy that actually talks about mainstream education where students with disabilities should actually be with other learners, then it's critical that our teachers come out with skills that actually will promote access and inclusion. So the paper cautioned on the assumption that there's a culture of use and reliance on modern electronic technologies. It further recommended the shift of e-learning should be with a full understanding of teaching, learning, assessment, and support for diverse students. In 2016 and 2018, I wrote on Ubuntu, considered in the space of people with disabilities. This paper emanated from the project on archaeology of Ubuntu. This NRF-funded project was led by Prof. Letseka, and I was the KwaZulu-Natal chapter leader, and I ensured that we solicit views of elders on how Ubuntu informed the treatment of people with disabilities. The most exciting thing with this project was that everyone that went to different provinces and different countries was strictly advised to use their own languages when they actually interact with the elders. Now, I would say that that was promoting access, because we didn't do the normal thing of researchers preparing tools in English and going out to provinces where the languages that they do not speak, which in a way breaks the whole code of ensuring that we are accessible. One would ask why we found this important. Well, because attitudinal barriers are formed through social constructions of people that are different from the norm. These two papers revealed that traditional society regarded the birth of a child with a disability as a curse from God and a punishment from the ancestors. It also divulged that marrying or dating a person with a disability was unthinkable due to stigma and dehumanization of people with disabilities. As much as these papers reported on history, but they revealed why higher education institutions might still find it hard to achieve equitable access. Higher education institutions will only be inclusive when social constructions of people with disabilities become positive. A recommendation of using community-engaged research to renegotiate, reskill, restructure society towards genuine inclusion was made. In 2021, Prof. Koza and I worked on using the community of inquiry to facilitate the design of a holistic e-learning experience for students with visual impairment. This paper highlighted the critical role played by ICT tools in enabling the facilitation of inclusive teaching and learning in ODL contexts. It also pointed out the role of different stakeholders known as communities of inquiry in ensuring cognitive, social, and teaching presence. Equally, the importance of complying with policies that ensure students' centeredness. Because research is not always structured, and it sometimes is caused by circumstances at hand, Manyonga and Ngubane worked on curriculum implementation and the right to education during COVID-19 in South Africa. This was necessitated by the abrupt move to online learning during COVID-19 induced lockdowns, which led to the exclusion of marginalized learners and students. Traditional teaching and online teaching require different curriculum design, implementation, and delivery strategies. Yet, teachers were never trained on how to teach and assess virtually. Researchers should collaborate with others to assess the impact of the prevailing phenomena on human rights. This will ensure that restrictions imposed do not impact negatively on vulnerable communities like those with disabilities and those from rural communities. Similarly, due to COVID-19 accelerated digitized learning adoption, Lehong, Falbilun, and Sanders 2022 did a study on the use of and usability of learning management systems at UNISA. This heuristic evaluation through usability testing with eye tracking, post-test system usability track, and interviews of and about the learning management system revealed findings that indicated a need for improvement so that there is inclusion. This paper makes recommendations among them to ensure that UNISA's learning management system is designed to be accessible to users with special needs, provide option to personalize the user interface, and allow customized features to suit their needs. This would be useful for students with disabilities, but also for any other learner. And so these particular authors are actually drawing attention to the importance of making sure that virtual learning is actually inclusive. For access to both higher and basic education to be achieved, there needs to be a budget for each department to ensure that access is not an afterthought. This means that for each strategic goal that is translated into an operational and implementation plan, there should be a consultation with experts and representatives from marginalized communities to draw a budget for actual activities. Ngubane 2021 wrote on illicit financial flows and the marginalized population, a case of people with disabilities in South Africa. Here, she highlighted the way marginalized communities, including people with disabilities, are sometimes excluded from financial benefits meant for developmental purposes. Let me just remind you. Do you remember when you were getting 350 during COVID when you were not working? Did you ensure that the other person with a disability, maybe that didn't have a grant, also got that 350? So this paper actually draws the readers to the fact that sometimes community and developmental benefits are not actually benefit, and they are not equally accessible for all. Niche postulates that economic marginalization also happens through exclusion from opportunities, resources, rights, and free markets. This chapter also demonstrates how donations and sponsorships that are meant for people with disabilities are squandered and misappropriated, which amounts to illicit financial flows. The kind of financial exclusion heightens the barriers to financial access. When I became a researcher, I planned that I will not only supervise others to be scholars, but I made a deliberate effort to recruit and supervise people with disabilities so that they can also use research to change their own situation, tell the disability story from their own perspective, and also contribute towards equitable access for future generations. So I have actually the pride of presenting my brick 2, which is breaking the access barriers through postgraduate supervision. Dr. Thomas Ongolo is blind and is a graduate of the University of South Africa. I had the pleasure of supervising him with Professor Maphalala, and he was actually looking at the issue of an analysis of policy guiding the design and delivery of an inclusive curriculum at an ODL university. This is a PhD study. So you can see that Dr. Ongolo actually getting the PhD has actually, it has high chances of him also doing research and hence breaking access barriers. Then I have Dr. Mamafa, who looked at the availability and use of ICT for the visually impaired in selected public libraries in South Africa. This was a doctoral thesis that I co-supervised with Professor Ngulube and Professor Dube. Now, whether you like it or not, you can see how we are going to different areas and making sure that we break those barriers. Then we have Dr. Olwetu Sipuka, who has a physical disability, and of course you know him. He is the Dean of Deans of University of South Africa. Olwetu explored a framework for decolonized disability-inclusive student work support practices in an ODL institution. And co-supervising Dr. Sipuka with Profs Lorenzo and Bihari Lik from UCT gave me an opportunity to understand how decoloniality can be implemented to improve support for students with disabilities. And of course, it gave me a chance to collaborate with other disability scholars and of course, at UCT. Then, Mrs. Fiona Anderson was our master's student who I co-supervised with Dr. Asterian Zamba, and she was looking at exploring academic support strategies for mathematics students with dyscalculia. This is a disability for people that actually cannot comprehend numeracy. And this study was done in Namibia. So since she completed her master's, now she's doing her PhD with us, and she's looking at mobile learning. So you can see how we are slowly touching different areas with the issues of inclusion. Then Mrs. Adeleke looked at exploring teaching presence as academic support for students with disabilities in ODL. She also is now also doing her PhD, and she's looking forward to being a specialist in teaching practice. Then, of course, Mr. Peggy Dlamini, who had brain aneurysm and therefore is paralyzed on his left side, is also doing his study on mobility impairment in the corporate world, integration and reintegration for inclusion of employees with mobility impairment. So you can see he is from the School of Business. We are now entering the business sector, and we want to make sure that we break those access barriers so that people with disabilities can also work in the corporate sector. Then the third brick is the issue of engaged scholarship. As part of promoting holistic development and following disability slogan of nothing about us without us, through community engagement, we ask people with disabilities what they would like us to research. Here, I had been invited to be part of the speakers that spoke to Freedom Park about making heritage spaces inclusive for diverse groups of people, including those with disabilities. Here, we had an engagement with the leaders of the disability sector with the aim of encouraging them to register for master's and doctoral studies. Access to research would give them skills to tell their own story. The slogan theme of this engagement was, "No research about us without us." So I'm glad to say that at the end of this, when we began this engagement, Mr. Thomas Ongolo was not a PhD holder, and as I introduced him before, he is now Dr. Thomas Ongolo. And we have also got other disability sector leaders that are also doing now their PhDs with an aim of making sure that they contribute to research and they tell their stories. Engagement with disabled people organizations leaders, where we engaged Dr. Williams, who's a disability activist from America, Dr. Maseko, who's from the University of Johannesburg, and Professor Grootboom, who's from UNISA, with an aim of getting diverse strategies to breaking access barriers. As we always say, nothing about us without us. There's a need to always consult people with disabilities so that you understand how they can be helped, because it's their experience, it's not yours. Here, Prof. Mapalala and I were at the Bawinile School for the Physically Challenged, which is at KwaDindi in Pietermaritzburg. Mrs. Bawinile Mdunyelwa has since completed her master's in social work after we completed the Engaged Scholarship and motivating teachers to study further regardless of their disability. As we are slowly breaking the barriers, more and more people with disabilities are becoming PhD holders who are ready to research, lecture, and serve as consultants. Now, if you remember, we have the NDP 2030, which is actually aimed at ensuring that we have more PhD holders in South Africa. Now, I'm working in making sure that in whatever percentage that we'll reach, people with disabilities are also a percentage. Then intersectoral engagement addressing gender-based violence amongst women with disabilities at Horong, at UNISA main campus. Those that know these particular stalwarts, Professor Brain is known for dealing with the gender-based violence. Dr. Chisale, who is in Zimbabwe, also is known on looking at gender-based violence. So this was another engagement where we were actually talking about the prevalence of disability abuse, which was actually glaring. Then the engagement with Mr. Frank Kruger from Quad Para Association in KwaZulu-Natal, where we shared best practices of ensuring access for people with physical disabilities. In 2019, Chisale and I tackled the often ignored rape and sexuality topic for people with disabilities. And you know, normally when you look at people with disabilities, people think, no, the only issue they have is disability. They forget they're also human beings, and they are not asexual. They also have relationships, and therefore they also face gender-based violence. This paper on male rape and consensual sex, hidden hegemonic masculinities by Zulu-speaking men with disabilities, contributes to gender studies concepts of consensual sex, male rape, and masculinity discourses. It also shines a light on the contradictions that exist among Zulu males with disabilities regarding their sexual acts with their caregivers. Most importantly, it reveals the perceived power dynamics that could affect male students with disabilities in educational institutions. This could make it difficult to solve complicated sexual acts where men feel they are masculine enough if they turn down unwanted sexual advances from women. Then brick 4. As we are working in the higher education institutions, we need to think about multiplying ourselves, and that is done through mentorship. This is the most exciting part of being in this profession, as it allows you to multiply yourself and develop giants that add to knowledge production in ways that could be more innovative than yours. As much as professors must mentor as part of their job description, only umuntu ngubuntu ngabantu would make an individual passionate about sharing their skills. Most universities have formal mentorship programs which tend to focus on the administrative tick box exercise. Mentors that normally inspire others are those that move beyond the final programs. Being a professor in a given space makes you a leader, and leadership makes you a selfless servant who should ensure that there is enough supply of scholars as per the NDP 2030. Here in this picture, I'm actually smiling with my mentors, Professor Mpine Makwe, Professor Alan Tate, who hosted me for the Vision Keepers Fellowship at the Open University in UK and the University of Cambridge in UK. And then Professor Mwekesi Litseka. I would say that through them and other selfless senior scholars, I've learned that lighting another person's candle does not dim my light. These are some of the works that I've produced with my mentees to ensure that they also break access barriers through their own scholarship. South Africa has the target of producing 100 doctoral graduates per million by 2030. Having a doctoral qualification should transcend to enthusiasm for research and knowledge production rather than just a title change. And mentorship for both academic and support staff would make this a reality. Then we move on to brick 5. As academics, we are not meant to only play a developmental role inside the institution itself. Instead, we must be actively involved in different areas of society to influence and informing teaching and learning and also curriculum design. These authors, Nogard and Bankston, point out the importance of universities integrating with society and society integrating with universities. As highlighted above in the research outputs, I believe that it's through working together that equitable access will be achieved in society, academia, government, non-governmental organizations, and in the corporate sector. Here we were in the African Union, and you can see yours dearest there in the corner. As a researcher within an open distance Learning Institute, I had the opportunity to be a disability expert at the African Union Disability High-Level Consultations. This gave me a chance to influence the thinking around the importance of research in enhancing the inclusion and access work they do through their NGOs. Through these academic citizenship roles, I have managed to get more people with disabilities interested in pursuing their postgraduate studies in their chosen fields. Here we are with the Namibian Deputy Minister of Disability Affairs, the Honorable Alexia Manombe Ngube, and our PhD student from UP. He calls himself Doug Wakene, who is the co-founder and director of Disability Consulting Advocate, Educator, and researcher on disability rights from Ethiopia. Doing academic research does not serve a purpose until the results are shared in different popular platforms. This allows the non-academics to actually challenge and engage the results, hence benefiting from the knowledge, and sometimes even correcting our own findings. Here you can see where I actually, worked with Dr. Oliver Mutanga and Dr. Manyonga, who was my postdoctoral fellow, and we were looking at the issue of the South African new higher education disability policy. And we actually highlighted that as much as the policy is there, but it is flawed. The pandemic brought opportunities and challenges for all communities. This piece that we published here on the conversation opened an opportunity for radio interviews during disability months, where I actually go and talk about the issues of how people with disabilities are interacting with learning, teaching, and assessment spaces. Then breaking barriers was also done through accepting to serve in the Advocacy and Resource Center for Students with Disabilities, ACSWID, which is here at UNISA, where I was given the opportunity of working with the most professional and hardworking team who provide application, registration, funding, academic, technological, library, and extracurriculum support for students with disabilities. This allowed me to work directly with the students with disabilities, and here, in this picture, you see the UNISA Women's Forum recognizing the excellence in the services that we provide. So then you'll ask yourself, after all this work, where do I go after this particular lecture? As we have seen above, that breaking the access barriers cannot be done in isolation. And without guiding policies, I plan to work on core design of an e-inclusion policy at the government level, filtering down to breaking access barriers in all departments, including the basic education and higher education training. So part of being responsible and of being a responsible global citizen is to learn from those who have done it well. I'm therefore eternally grateful to my respondent, Professor Sandra Sanchez-Gordon from Ecuador, for actually coming to respond, because this will give us a chance to actually see how we can design the e-inclusion policy, which Ecuador has done so well. I also plan to do more research towards improving the field of disability support from government influence and monitored inclusion policies. I also plan to work together with legal experts to create an Access for Inclusion Accountability Management Guide. Consequent management should be mandatory at all educational institutions to curb deliberate barriers to access which deny marginalized students their right to education and development. I also plan to work to identify digital access pioneers to establish functional diversity at ODL institutions. This is very critical because ICT is always looked at as if they are the ones that are providing the service. But we need to understand that ICT is there to support the project, the academic project. So we need to get to that level where the issue of access and inclusion is actually prioritized. And then I plan to fully direct my access on research, on digital learning platforms, digital skills for marginalized students, and anything technology that will make future learning accessible for all. So in conclusion, breaking the barriers to achieve authentic access for all requires rethinking and restructuring of systems. It requires rethinking of policies so that they are flexible. And discourse that actually we are doing, it should be within the transdisciplinary lens. Because when you go to society, you don't have, no, this is maths, this is law, this is that. Society is integrated. When there's a problem that faces a human being, we all come together and try to come with an integrated solution. COVID-19 has opened opportunities for the adoption of learning, of design actually for functional diversity. Now the question is, how do we get computing and all the instructional designers to talk to this and guide academics and support staff on how to design for functionality? So let's all work together to ensure that people with disabilities and all other marginalized groups access our institutions and succeed in making their lives sustainable. I thank you very much for being here, and I'm hoping that our research and other interventions will manage to break the barriers to access until even the last brick that you see on the screen is removed. Thank you to Sophie Mabaso for translating with sign language. Thank you for sacrificing your valuable time to come here and listen to me online. Thank you.
Professor Meyiwa, Vice Principal of Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization of University of South Africa. Professor Makoe, Acting Executive Dean of the College of Education. Professor Gaza, Head of College of Education, Office of Graduate Studies. Professor Sindil Amina Ngubane, Professor and Acting Chair of Department, Institute of Open Distance Learning Research. Colleagues from the sister University of South Africa. Colleagues from other sister universities. Dear students, family members and friends of Professor Ngubane, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, greetings from Ecuador, South America, in the middle of the world. Thank you for having me for this very special occasion, the inaugural lecture of Professor Ngubane. Although we haven't had the opportunity of meeting each other in person, since we live in different continents, we are certainly close and united by our passion to help making education more accessible to every person all over the world, especially the south part of it. This is why it is for me a great pleasure to participate today as respondent of the inaugural lecture of Professor Ngubane entitled Breaking the Access Barriers Through Transdisciplinary Research, One Brick at a Time. I want to congratulate Professor Ngubane for this important milestone in her academic path that we are celebrating today. I am going to highlight several important aspects of Professor Ngubane lecture, beginning with one that is game-changing. The focus not in the disabilities, but on the barriers students with disabilities faces on everyday basis when interacting with both physical and digital environments. These barriers, not the disabilities, are the real cause for the inequality in access to education that the students with disabilities face, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America and all over the world. This is a global issue that needs to be resolved as it is reflected directly in goals number 4, quality education, number 10, reduce inequalities, and indirectly in goals number 1, no poverty, number 8, decent work and economic growth, and 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions of the 2030 United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development, which motto is, by the way, leave no one behind. Another very important aspect of Professor Ngubane research path is her strategy of using transdisciplinary research. Just as specialists in a specific branch of health, such as cardiologists, requires the collaboration of other specialists to detect and treat a systemic disease of the human body. Likewise, a systemic problem of society cannot be resolved by a single scientific discipline, but with the contingent of several disciplines. The systemic problem Professor Ngubane is actively working on is the low access to online education of underserved students in general, and underserved students with disabilities in particular. As Professor Ngubane points out in her presentation, Most of them live in rural areas or impoverished urban areas and have limited access to internet and computers. Being mobile phones their main option to connect to e-learning platforms, such platforms need to be responsive to the small size of phone screens, allow students to download and upload educational materials on demand, and be able to adapt to the specific needs of each student according to their situation of life. Unfortunately, currently that is not the case. Digital barriers are still present and the systemic problem remains to be solved. As we just heard, starting with her doctoral research, Professor Ngubane has made an extensive contribution as part of the scientific global community that investigates this problem. I totally agree with Professor Ngubane that part of the solution is to work with teachers of all levels and disciplines to provide them with the awareness, training, and tools they need to engage in inclusive education. Teachers do want to help their students out. Sometimes they just don't know how. Better prepared teachers will be able to help their students with disabilities to reach their maximum potential by removing barriers related to digital literacy, use of assistive technologies, use of assisted educational resources, and so on. Not only teachers, but also instructional designers need awareness, training, and tools to be better prepared to develop inclusive educational curriculums, as Professor Ngubane also points out. In her transdisciplinary quest, Professor Ngubane has also researched and tackled the issue of budgeting necessary to make all this happen. I find particularly important the work of Professor Ngubane regarding the mentoring of new generations of accessibility scholars, including her proposal of team supervision of master and doctoral candidates. Her approach of community engagement also makes a huge difference from traditional ways of doing research in academic institutions of developed countries to a more people-centered approach that we need in Africa and Latin America. As for future endeavors, Professor Ngubane proposals towards authentic access for all to research deserves all the necessary support. Today's presentation of Professor Ngubane allows us to reflect on the importance of making education accessible to all students with and without disabilities as the path for them to achieve employability, independence, and most importantly, happiness in their lives. Professor Ngubane, once again, congratulations on your achievements. To close up, let me just express this one final thought. From the South, united, Africa and Latin America, we can and we will define tomorrow one brick at a time. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, we really have had lots of information on matters of access and how future research could be worked on, whipped on, and actively engaged with. I use those terminologies deliberately because we need a lot of work to be done along this area. And thank you to all of you for the congratulatory remarks that you have put in the chat box and all the ideas and future research that you need to be continuing to congratulate Prof. Ngubane with and get here to do in this lecture. We have been educated indeed. We know more and are more wiser than we were before this lecture. And I must appreciate Prof. Ngubane herself and the family that she's brought along for attending this professorial lecture and do so on a weekday. I appreciate Prof. Sanche Gordon for a very engaging response. I express immense gratitude to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for this support. And of course, as we are across the platforms, to thank boys and girls as we've turned our homes into offices and boardrooms as well, for supporting the work of Professor Ngubane. Expressing gratitude further is to the College of Education for supporting her scholarship and also the institute that she is leading. I express gratitude singling out colleagues also who have not been privileged like me to come to the podium, but who've made this lecture a success. Colleagues who are working behind the scenes to ensure that the lecture at an institutional level is something that we pride ourselves with. The corporate affairs colleagues within the Department of Institutional Advancement, media and video photography colleagues, IT colleagues, facilities colleagues, and everyone that I will have possibly forgotten to make mention of here. We thank you for all your contribution. Without you, this lecture would not have been successful. Good evening.